Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kristen Biermeyer. I'm the marketing manager for Wagner CPAs, and I am so happy to have you all join us today for Faith in Numbers as we discuss our topic of leading in a new normal. The presentation is being recorded today, and I'll be emailing the link to view that recording as well as any handouts after today's event. Today's event is intended to be highly interactive, so the use of cameras and microphones is definitely encouraged. We would love to see and hear from you today and to make it as interactive and engaging as possible. We just ask for you to please mute your microphone when you're not speaking to help minimize any background noise. On your screen, you can see today's agenda. We have 2 presentations as well as a panel discussion planned for today. In between our sessions, we'll be having random breakout room assignments. We'll leave the breakout rooms open for about 10 minutes for you to interact with fellow attendees, discuss key takeaways, and have some time to share and to get to know each other. There will then be about 5 minutes for you to get up and stretch or refill your cup of coffee before we begin the next session. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Our last session today is a panel discussion where we will have plenty of time to address all the questions that have come in during the morning, as well as any questions that you'd like to ask live at that time. With that, I will turn you over to one of our hosts and presenters for today, Hannah Lancer.
Good morning. Thanks, Kristen. We're excited to have you with us today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Kim Porter. She is going to be leading us off at this keynote session. Before I do that, I just want to say welcome and give a little bit of intro. This is an event that we have been excited to kind of resume again. We did it a lot during the pre-pandemic times in person, and it was a really beneficial time for everybody. And so we're excited to bring it back and have that ability to connect with you all today on this topic of leading in times of change. So I am one of our managers here at Wagner CPAs and heavily involved in our religious niche. And so we're really happy that you joined us. So with that, let me introduce Kim. She is the Executive Vice President and the Chief of Staff to the President of InterVarsity. InterVarsity is an organization here located actually in Madison that has nearly over 1,000 employees in the United States, and they operate across the world though. And some of you might be familiar with that. They're heavily involved in missions and on campuses here. Kim comes with a lot of experience just leading, especially during this last season of COVID, leading an organization through that change. She joined InterVarsity staff in 1991 as on the cultivating, more on the leadership side, and then joined later to the senior leadership role in 2014, first as Vice President of Learning and Talent, and then the Vice President of Ministry Services in Finance and Administration. So she brings a wealth of knowledge, both from boots on the ground and real life experience. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thank you, Kim.
Indeed, so good to be with you. Grateful. Greetings from our headquarters here over on Whitney Way, Science Drive. For those of you that have ever gone to Walgreens and you wonder what's over there, that's us right here, InterVarsity. So good to be with you. I just wanted to begin even by just saying thank you. As I looked over the list of organizations that you represent, from congregations, rescue missions, school, a hospital foundation, I just want to name that you are making an impact in the lives of individuals and families and in our broader community. Even as I looked through the list, I was struck by a repeating title of hope. There's anchor of hope, inspiring hope. And I realized, isn't that why we've said yes to serve in the roles that we have? That we long to be agents of hope. We want to see lives transformed. And I know as leaders, you carry a lot. And I pray that this time will be an opportunity that you can receive. I love the chance to invest in leaders And it was a privilege for me to serve as a consultant for various organizations in the last 3 years. And a common thread that I heard, when are we going to get back to normal? So if that's you, you can say in the chat, yeah, I've asked that question a time or two in the last 3 years. But we know now, right? If we've lived through this pandemic and all of this disruption and the verb that was common, right? We've pivoted so many times, we'd like to never hear that word again. But we know that there's no going back to our 2019 world. That the new normal really is managing change and transition. We've probably heard about that skill in leadership for the last couple of decades, but we got a master's program in it during the pandemic. And on this side, we have to figure out, what does it mean to navigate the ever-changing environment that we find ourselves in? And I just, grateful. This conference is a perfect example. The team began planning for their first in-person Faith in Numbers conference on this side of the pandemic. And then in response to many of you and your organizations, they needed to shift and move it online. I would imagine 5 years from now, it wouldn't even have been an option to host it online. But we've learned so much through the pandemic that this was an easy move to do. And even as we try and find our new normal, it seems like even that new normal changes. Another example, emerging from the pandemic, we might have all heard about the Great Resignation. And so we were desperate to keep and retain our good staff. So we came up with all sorts of creative ways to retain them. But now, as I turn on social media or the news, it is pretty common to hear about massive layoffs in response to the downturn of our financial markets. So are we trying to retain or lay off? Yes, right? So the new normal is that change is constant, that we as leaders need to learn how to navigate for ourselves and shepherd the people as we lead through the different places where we find ourselves. So rather than talk about this in an abstract way, I'd like to invite you to choose one area of change that you want to focus on and apply this learning. So for the next hour that we are together, we'll talk about a number of principles of how you go about navigating and leading your people. But just to pause and say, what's one area that you're thinking about these days as a leader? Is it the financial challenge that you may be navigating for your organization? Is it this hybrid workforce and trying to figure out how to remote those that are here in the building? How do I navigate that? Are you trying to discern, okay, there's a whole new generation that has entered into the workplace. For those of us in InterVarsity, the campus is shifting from millennials to Gen Z. Is that something you're thinking about? Or maybe you're trying to reinvent the whole model of your organization on this side of the pandemic. I just want to pause. And if you have that handout, you can definitely jot it there. Or if you just got a piece of paper at your desk, wherever you're sitting, just write down, jot down. What's one situation that you want to apply the principles that we're going to be talking about today? So go ahead and just jot that down. If you want to throw it in the chat, that's fine too. But what's one area that you're thinking about as a leader that you need to navigate change? I'm guessing for many of you, it was top of mind. You're like, yeah, I'm navigating this. I don't quite know what's happening. So I want to be able to say first that no one can give you an exact roadmap, but there are principles to apply in this journey. If you were to look at my bookshelf that's behind me here in my office, you would see that I have numbers of books devoted to change management. But there is one that has stood this test of time, and that's William Bridges' Managing Transitions. And even though it was written in the 80s, I consistently still see articles or blogs, posts that reference his critical work. And Bridges would argue that as we talk about change, that change is situational. It's something that happens. It's an external event that takes place, and often quickly, right? We have to pivot and work remotely, or you find yourself having to implement layoffs, right? That's an event that happens. But transitions are psychological. That's the internal response that people have, both in their heart and their mind. And often it creates an internal crisis. So I want to say, as on the onset, if you want to be a successful change leader, we need to shepherd our people through the transitions rather than focus simply on the outcome and pushing for that change. Bridges would say there's 3 key phases in this model. And if you start in the lower left-hand corner, you start with ending. And we'll talk about what that means, the loss that's involved, the letting go that's required. And after you've ended, you enter into this neutral zone. And then finally, there is the new beginning. And there's no way to circumvent the processes, right? Wouldn't we love to just head right into the new space? That's not going to be the case. And the key is to know, what do you do as a leader in each of these phases to help navigate the process, including a whole host of emotions that are connected as people respond in each phase. Change is never described as a straight path to the new destination, but it's often just a crazy roller coaster ride. And I don't know about you, but I'm never the one in the front of the roller coaster with my hands raised and so excited about what this turn's going to be. But more, I'm the person that is white knuckling as I'm listening, going up the roller coaster at that click, 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 ascending, wondering what's going to be like. Am I going to just lose my cookies as we descend? And as you think about the changes that you're leading, it's helpful to note that emotions are at an all-time high. If you think about a scale of 1 to 10, emotions in the season of change are at a 12. And this is normal. Your role as a leader is to create the safe space to navigate all of those emotions and not take it personal or think you've done something wrong or that you should end the process. You just need to hold the space for folks to enter in and work it out. So let's begin with the ending. Transitions always start with an ending. You cannot start the new thing until you have let go of the old. It involves a loss as a door closes. And so a question I have for you is, how will you help your team leave what they've known, have been comfortable in, and step through that door into an unknown space? And there's a key role for you to play as the leader, and that is recognizing that people will have a lot of questions that are voiced and unvoiced. And so your critical role is to communicate. And then communicate and communicate again. You might think I'm just over and over and over, but they say it's actually on the 7th time that people actually dial in and are like, oh, this is for real. And the temptation as leaders is to wait until things are certain. But people need clarity at this stage, not certainty. Clarity is the word. It's really scary to not know what is around the corner. And if your team hasn't heard from you, they will write their own narrative. How you communicate matters. Empathy is key, naming the losses, clarifying what is being left behind and what isn't. So I want to offer you an example that I'm leading in this season. And that is life here at our national headquarters. You may remember pre-pandemic when you talked about going to work and it actually meant driving into an office every day. Do you remember that? that was what that was connected to. I'm guessing you've all navigated the changing workforce. That some folks that come in, they're fully remote now, some are hybrid, and there's a very small handful, and true here in our office, that they actually come into this building every single day. The InterVarsity employees who are part of our organization pre-pandemic, they are experiencing a significant loss of what it used to be like. There were 125 of us in this building, and there was a lot going on in our space on any given day. The lunchroom was full, training room might have had a group of people in there. There were staff from around the country that flew into this space for cross-functional team meetings. It was incredibly dynamic. Now, we average 35 people in any given week that are in this space. And rather than full and loud and dynamic, it's crickets. September marked a year of instituting the flexible work model. It's okay if folks want to be remote, if they want to be hybrid, or if they want to be in the office. We allowed in this last year departments to discern, supervisors to work it out. We did not mandate that you had to come back. And a year into that flexible workforce, recognizing now there are whole departments that did not return. Here's my role in communicating reality today. It's critical that I interpret, that I share what we know and what is happening and what's not going to happen. So this is kind of my communication, that my mantra that I'm saying over and over again. There are 35 of us, and that's a team that's coming into this building. I am not going to intervene and force any more teams or people to come back. We're going to continue to provide the technology so that folks that are in the office or working from home, that you can be ensured that you'll have a great virtual experience as a team. And my folks are pretty smart, and they're quick to ask the question, yeah, but what about this building? And so my mantra about this, it's true that we would not have bought this space for 35 people. But there is no market for office buildings. So we're not going to sell this building. But we are looking to share the space. We want to rent out our empty offices and cubicles to other ministries in town who might need a space to co-work together. Now, it is tempting to wait until I've got it all figured out and worked out a perfect plan. But what I need to do is share with people along the way, even when I don't know some of the answers. And so as I can get their initial responses, I can begin to then figure out together, what is it that we need to do in this space? So the question for you, as you go back to the thing that you jotted down or you're thinking about, what is ending for your team? What are the losses associated with that change? And what's critical for you to be communicating right now for folks to find their footing? So again, if you want to jot that down on your handout, on the piece of paper that you have, if you want to put it in the chat, feel free. I'll just give you a moment for your own reflection before we move on. So as folks close the door, recognize the endings, name the losses, you then enter into this, what Bridges calls the neutral zone. But even Bridges recognizes that that neutral title is not the reality. It really is the messy middle. For those of you that come from maybe a faith-based, you might know the story about the Israelites, that journey. They leave and end this life in Egypt. They cross over into this wilderness space. And they have a promise of where they're headed, right? This promised land filled with milk and honey, but they don't go straight there. There is this in-between space, the wilderness. And if you know anything about this story, in this place is great leadership lessons, right? There's a lot of complaining and whining and even nostalgia about the good old days in Egypt. It's the in-between space. You've left what you've known, but you have not yet arrived in the new reality. So in my example, right, pre-pandemic life in the building is over. 125 of us, that's done. And we know that we are actively looking for ministries to join us here in that space, but that day is not yet here. So we long for this building to be full again and co-working space, but we're not there. And it's tempting to get used to this limbo space, to never actually transition and finalize the change. So what is the role of the leader to make sure we keep moving and shepherding through the process? And that's to create multiple ways for your team to engage and give feedback about where you're headed. If the first stage is you talking and creating a new narrative, this second phase is about your team and your organization having different ways to talk back to you. And so some of what you're doing is you're asking, what do you see are the obstacles from what would hold us back from getting where we are today to where we want to go? How do you suggest we overcome those obstacles? Even begin to look and assess, what about our people or our systems and our structures that are misaligned? What do we need to do to align where we're headed in this new reality? What needs to change? You are inviting them to be a part of the solution. The key in this stage is to invite opportunities for input and participation. And this is a time to build off what you've done in the past. Are you a task force organization? Is that what you typically do? Now would be the time to gather folks from every department to start creating new recommendations. Do you do town hall meetings? Are you a survey organization? I would suggest doing all three different opportunities. Every different medium that you have of getting feedback, do that now. Because you want to create multiple opportunities for folks to voice their opinions, their ideas, the ways that they would prioritize things. And for you as a leader, you want to surface all of the resistance, because that will help you determine where do you need to build greater ownership. People want to feel heard, and so you want to invite them in to be part of this new reality of where you're headed. So again, my example. So I hosted some workshops that were open to everyone. We want to repurpose this space. And then I attended, but I did not lead them because I wanted it to have a sense of like, we're co-creating our new reality. I am just sitting here at the table alongside everyone else. And so what emerged were recommendations that I now consistently share with all 35. So what they wanted was, we're spread out on 3 floors. So the first recommendation is, can we consolidate so that there's a little bit more momentum than a ghost town? The second one was, can we reconfigure the space? We maximized this building when we first bought it with cubicles spread on every floor that no longer serves us. Can we remove them and think about new ways to design our space? And then lastly, they thought of, can we have a coffee bar? Because I might be in this building all day long and not see anyone. It would be great to have a central space to connect. That might even mimic that I'm drawn to go to Starbucks. Can we create a Starbucks-like feel here? I might be more drawn to come into the building. So that was my first wave of getting input. And then I went on a listening tour that I sat with the different teams and I asked them, what are your space needs Let's look at the floor plan. Where might be the best place for you to move? And where could you fit in the new arrangement? I want to return to my opening line from Bridges, that change is situational, but transitions are psychological. Change is the easy part. I can ask my facilities director for carts. People can put their stuff on it and move them up to the 3rd floor. It takes an hour tops. But the transition, what I discovered as I went around from team to team, that they were internalizing the impact and coming to terms with it. The emotions were high. These are some of the things that I heard, right? Well, I really like my side of the building. The lighting in my side of the building is so much better than that dark side. I don't want to be in that fluorescent space. I like my area that's a ghost town. If you make me move, I'm going to work from home. Again, they are beginning to navigate the loss of the new change that this would take on. And quite possibly, we have to understand as leaders, the thing that we're doing may just be one of many changes that folks on our team are navigating, right? It's things that are going on at home, whether that's stuff with their families or aging parents, their own health issues. Some of the intense emotional responses is because the situation at hand is just the tipping point for all the things that are going on. So I want to pause and for you to consider this phase, this neutral zone, before you get to the new place and after you've left what you know, the messy middle. How do you want to engage your teams, your organization, to invite their input and participation? Again, just take a moment, jot down some of your ideas. What comes to mind? For those of us that know this scriptural story about the Israelites, hopefully we won't be in this messy middle for 40 years, that there actually is a crossing over into the new beginning. But we understand that that new beginning is marked by living into new understanding, new values, new behaviors. There's no longer confusion about who you are and what you'll be doing. You will know that you have arrived when people begin to think, oh yeah, this is who we are. That it no longer is producing all of this anxiety. What's key for you in that phase is to celebrate the small wins, right? As you start into this new space, how do we memorialize at each key juncture along the way that you call it out and you celebrate the new behaviors? You call out and celebrate when you see folks pressing in. Oh, this is who we want to be. Again, my example. So we're just beginning into this space. So we had 5 people from one team moved from the 1st floor to the 3rd floor. They saw it and they wanted to coalesce with a different team in the building. As I did the listening tour, they thought, wow, in this new way, we might be able to have some linkages with this other department that we've never had before. So why don't we move and be right next to them? So as they took that risk, we moved them, right? I hosted a party and invited everybody in the building to come up to the 3rd floor and welcome these 2 new teams. I made sure that our president was in the building that day, so he could have donuts and coffee with everyone and say thank you. And then I had some of the folks that were moving to share around the circle what they were most excited about. What was it that they thought, yeah, we're hoping that this will happen, that it will actually accelerate our projects and our cross-functional work together. And the president had an opportunity to thank them publicly. Thanks for moving, right? And it helps spur on ideas for other teams. And now there's 3 other teams that want to merge. And you want to bet that I'm going to host another party when they move in the building. We're beginning to give a picture of what our future will look like. Now, we are still a ways off from having organizations come and fill this space and become a co-working organization. But you better believe that when it does happen, right, there's going to be all sorts of ways that we celebrate and honor that new organization. We interview them. We have a way that we celebrate their joining with us and who will we be together. So again, I just want to pause and invite you to jot down, what is it that you want to reinforce as you lay the foundation for who you will be in this change? What is it that you want to call forth in your teams, in your organization? So some of my priority is to create space for our learning across departments, across organizations. So I've given you some time to process your situation on your own. And I'm sure everyone felt like, wow, I need a lot more time to write, right? I just need to think about this. So some of us, we really are helped in our learning by processing with other people. And so we wanted to create some space right here this morning for you to be able to meet together and process, okay, how might this fit in my organization? You see it there on your handout, right? So we're going to meet together in triads. And I just want you to begin to reflect on, how does this connect with what I've heard, with what I've already been thinking about? You might have been someone that's been leading change in your organization for a long time. You might have a different change framework. How does it connect with what you already know? Is there any new ahas from this? You're like, maybe you think, I'm interpreting the last change that blew up. Now I see what either I missed or what was happening, right? And then even reflect for yourself as a leader, as you think about these 3 phases, what's the easiest one for you? What plays to your strength? And which one might be the hardest, right? Is it the waiting? Is it the in-between? You just want to get there. And what's it going to mean for you as a leader to navigate that space, both for yourself and for those that you lead? So you have the debrief questions on your handout as well, but we want to create some space for you to connect with one another.
Wonderful, thank you. Kristen is gonna send us off right now into groups of 3. So when you get an invitation from Zoom to join one of the breakout rooms, just please accept that. And we will discuss and come back after about 10 to 15 minutes or so. Kristen, you can go ahead. Good to go? All right. Kim, any final words for us? As we have returned before we.
Yes. It's right. As I'm guessing, as you talked about it, it's far more complex than a straight line, right? It's like, oh, is it possible to be ending and right? Are they all overlapped? Yes, it can be very cyclical. So if you're like, it seems far messier in all three stages. Yes. So if that is you, if you can say amen to that, you are not alone. You're not doing it wrong.
Yeah. Absolutely. Awesome. This is a new navigation for sure. So, all right. We are going to head into our break a little bit early. And this will be a chance for you to connect with a few other people. We'll do about 10 minutes, just general networking, and then share some stories about what you're going through, but just as an opportunity also for you to meet people in the same space as you. So this, even though we're virtual, it's still an opportunity to connect. And that is really one of the other values that we have for this conference, not just content, but also connection. And then we will have about 10 minutes of that time. And then there'll be another just like 5-10 minutes of we'll just break for everybody to go refresh your copies and get up and stretch and all that. And then we'll start again about 10:15 and kick it off with session number 2. So Kristen, you can send us off into groups again, and we'll chat for another 10 minutes or so. Thank you, Kim, so much. We really appreciate that. Our group had a nice discussion on just like, wow, it's really nice to hear this again. It's amazing how you kind of just take it for granted that you're in change constantly, but just to hear it as like, this is what, other people are going through this too, and just some ahas and some language to be able to put to what we're experiencing. So thank you for your insight. Okay, you can split us out, Kristen. Thank you. Today, I am going to introduce Melody. Many of you may have seen her in our webinars or any of our CNAP courses. She is a frequent webinar presenter, even during the times of COVID when we were talking a lot about the PPP loans. So she is no stranger to speaking, and we really appreciate that. Melody comes from a background actually in higher education. She was a previous professor at Edgewood and now is heavily involved in our audit department, but she also leads our advisory services. So it's given Melody some really amazing insights into organizations at many different stages and phases, different projects she's been able to work on, and also that auditing mentality, experience with nonprofits, with churches. And so I have just really enjoyed and had the privilege of working alongside Melody for many years. And I know that she has a lot of expertise and insight to share with us today. And she comes at it with such humility. So that's also a blessing. And we want to be able to highlight that today. So I'm going to transition and share my screen here, and then Melody is going to kick it off for us with metrics that matter.
Thank you, Hannah. I do not do public praise and acknowledgement well, so if I'm off kilter for a tiny bit here, that's why. I am very thankful for what I have been able to do and combining the different passions. And I'm thrilled to be here today and share some things with you. One of the items that Kim said was in changes, there's so much uncertainty. but we need that clarity. And what we're seeing with a lot of the financial numbers based and metrics that we use for decision making is that uncertainty. And yet the metrics can bring some clarity and help minimize some of that overwhelming uncertainty and not having the answers. The metrics can matter and they can provide us with that clarity and insight. So we're going to go through our agenda in this talk is to just talk about why and what's the purpose of re-examining potentially the metrics. As we're dealing with so much other change, why consider change in the metrics? And talking about how it's relevant and what the impact could be if we are willing to step out and embrace that changing to maybe some new ways of communicating the messages from a financial aspect. And then we'll look at some examples. So as educator and accountant, I always ask the why question. In the advisory work that I do, if somebody tells me when I say, okay, so why do you do this? Well, that's the way it's always been done, or because that was how it was when I got here. I understand that because of the uncertainty, but that is a key red flag to me to say, okay, let's really examine then, is this still valuable? So the primary why of doing this is that things evolve. Our whole theme today and what we've been talking about is that there's not a static status quo. Things are continuing to evolve and emerge, and that means the numbers and the reporting sometimes needs to emerge with that. One of the big things that I'm passionate about is accounting is great. I have been an accountant my whole career, before education, during doing education, and again now. But that language of accounting is not the same language as those who we're giving the information to. And so maybe there's an opportunity for change in some of the reporting that we do to make it easier to understand and to design the metrics that matter for that particular audience that we're trying to impact. So there's a lot of changing demands on data and responsibilities. And historically, we've taken the past financial information and tried to use it as a predictor for the future. And while there's a valuable role in that, what else can we possibly be doing to improve on some of that? One of the whys of what we report is the audience, and what's the purpose that they want it for? Is it decision making? Is it compliance? Is it something for an external user? Those potentially have very different needs, and that's one of the whys that we need to address. Hopefully internally, one of the big whys is that we're providing information that's critical for decision making and how we're going to manage the resources that we've been given to steward and maximize the impact from those resources. And everyone is part of the mission that we've been called to. And therefore, it's important that sometimes as finance professionals, we may sit back and say, okay, we just do the numbers, but we're just as called to have an impact, and we can do that with how we report. I'm going to hand it over to Hannah to explain some more.
Thank you. Well, I think that our experience, both Melody's and mine, has crossed the gamut of experience with, very complicated financial, sophisticated CPA team at their organization to a volunteer treasurer at a church who was self-taught and is just doing this out of the goodness of their heart. And so we understand that sometimes, accounting even for us is easy to fall into that jargon, and it's easy to just get into that space and just start talking and assume everybody understands. But the reality is there's always a wide spectrum of experience and knowledge and expertise. And so I think that a lot of what the pandemic a lot of this transition has taught us is that we shouldn't just do the status quo, like Melody was saying. Just because we've done it that way doesn't mean it's serving us well anymore. And so part of what I want to talk about is just essentially making numbers meaningful. So we look at this list of numbers here, and honestly, in our profession as accountants, especially in public accounting, it's been our job to essentially communicate the story that the numbers are telling us. And so when we look at financials, we see things that pop out to us. We see things that it's predicting potentially. We see the past, because I mean, it is past information. It's not current necessarily, but it is a language. And I think that even there are many people on this webinar today that are coming from different levels of knowledge, and for some they might be comfortable. You might be comfortable reading financials. For some of you, you may not be very comfortable reading financials, or maybe you feel comfortable reading them yourself potentially, but then having to explain them is a whole nother level, and the daunting task of potentially having to explain to a group that maybe the elders or your board of directors or the users of the financials, leaders and directors in your organization, that they are leaning on you to translate that information. And so that can be sometimes a daunting experience. So I wanted to share a quote here. It says that we lose information when we don't translate numbers into instinctive human experience. We do hard, often painstaking work to generate the right numbers to help make a good decision. But all that work is wasted if those numbers never take root in the minds of the decision makers. The whole point of accounting, the whole point of financial reporting is to give information to the decision makers to make useful decisions. It's useful information for them. So if that's not happening, we really are missing the mark. And I think that in this time of a lot of transition, like Kim was talking about, that neutral, messy space, it's a great opportunity to rethink, maybe revamp. And I'll kind of speak to that in a little bit about just inviting maybe different parties to provide feedback. So if the audience that you're speaking to doesn't get the numbers, they won't feel connected to them. And right now, it's really important, I think, especially when you are leading in times of uncertainty. There's been some discussions about budgeting and how do you make decisions about budgeting for the future when some of that is still very much unknown. Well, in order to even make decisions about that, you need to be able to understand what you're looking at currently. So that's just something really important. And I think that something that I've always taken to heart from, I don't even remember where it came from, but someone told me a long time ago that if I can't explain this concept to my grandmother, then I don't even fully comprehend it myself. To be able to translate complicated language into something that anybody could understand is honestly the next level skill set. So these sorts of stories can help leadership understand why you're sharing this information with them, why it's important, and help them be able to actually really absorb and connect with these numbers and not see them just as digits on a page. So I have definitely been in myself, and I've been around situations where it was just kind of like a fire hose approach of a lot of jargon, a lot of numbers. You can see net assets increased, but our Luna didn't, and our accounts payable went up and our cash went down, and we have a crisis. And everybody's just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So if you're in a group of people who are really close knit and trust one another, and there's that safe space to ask questions, I think that could work. But if you're in a room presenting to a lot of people and there's not a great space to provide that discussion, you most likely will lose people. So just knowing that, being cognizant of that, and honestly, if that's something that you feel like as you're listening right now, maybe I need to actually learn it more myself so I can translate this into a different language. Or you're thinking, I don't know if that is what's happening. You might just want to ask questions. So the next time you present financials to the group that you usually present to, or you're in a meeting where somebody is presenting financials to you, please just ask the question if this is connecting or if folks are understanding what it's trying to convey. I think that that's a great opportunity right now, especially to just revisit and make sure what is being reviewed and analyzed is actually helpful. So otherwise, it's honestly, it's just not going to really provide much benefit. So all that hard work, we really want to make sure that it's working and connecting with people and they're actually getting what they need to know. So, all right. I had mentioned before that there are many different voices that you might be wanting to consider as you're thinking about financials and presenting, and especially in this time, maybe revamping the way that you present information. So I just want to bring up this idea that there are many different perspectives that affect the financial elements, a financial outlook besides just the finance team. So there are some today with us that you are not involved in the accounting at all. You're not involved in the finance, but you are a leader at the organization that you're at. And we just want to say, your voice and your opinion and your perspective matters just as much as the accountant in terms of the difference that you bring, the ways that you see things. So there's many different kinds of perspectives. There's folks that are the risk takers. There are the conservative people. There's the innovative, always looking for the new thing. There's the traditional, no, this is what we've done. And then there's those that have been with the organization for a long time and have that institutional knowledge and have seen what's been tried. And then there are those that are fresh, have no background with the organization, that are just coming in with that fresh eyes. I think there's also generations that, we need to think about and take into consideration those from an older generation and those from a younger generation. So there are definitely people also that would prefer not to know any financial information, and they want to do the ministry, or they want to focus on the mission. They see it as kind of a side thing or an annoyance, and they just want to get it over with. And then there are those who probably ask so many questions that you almost are afraid to show them any financial reports, just not knowing what they'll ask. So it's just really important that when we are looking to optimize our mission and our impact, are we taking in all the right voices to make sure that's happening? So again, coming back to the why. So why does this matter? Why are we spending money on this area? Does it align with our mission, or are we just doing it because that's always been done, or because that's what's currently being asked for? It's very possible for your mission and your financials to be misaligned, not because it's, you're trying to, but it just can happen over time. And so even just translating that into less, financial language, you could even say, if we look back at where our dollars are being spent, does it line up with each of our core mission areas? So is it in proportion to where we want to be spending our time and energy? And I feel that's something that, pastors and executive leaders, they want to know that information. And that's something that I think would be helpful if we are able to provide that in our reports. So I think the other part with just thinking about voices and who's at that table is that sometimes it can become just an echo chamber, or it's too many of the same, a lot of the same voices, a lot of the same personalities. And so, or it's just what you've been doing. So just think about that and think about if there's somebody that maybe would be a good person to bring in for challenging status quo or providing that fresh perspective. Bringing in people who maybe are not at the top leadership, but who are implementing programs. Do they understand why their budget is the way it is? And do they see the big picture of how their role fits into this organization from a financial aspect? Another thing, maybe just in terms of decision making, is are our salaries and our wages aligned? And are we bringing in enough perspective to those discussions while still maintaining confidentiality? So there's many different voices that can have a really nice impact on this process besides just the same group of people. Now, it's something you do need to have discernment about because it is a very important area, and not just let anybody speak and override the system, but just a challenging thought for us today to think about who is at your table and are they the right people for that discussion. And then related to that, just want to talk a little bit about that process of discussion and how when we are in that space to actually listen to the voices that are sharing their expertise or that perspective. Like this puppy here, are we active listening? And there's been many times both Melody and I have the experiences where the information is just kind of shared. Either it's just not heard or it's not received well, and folks just kind of tune out a little bit, or maybe they just don't really understand and they're a little afraid to ask. So continuing to avoid the use of jargon and maybe posing questions to the group that you would actually expect to be getting. I've heard this before where talking with clients and they say, yeah, I want people to ask questions when I present the financials. And I do, and I present them and no response. It's just quiet. And I think to myself, well, they may not even know what to be asking, and or that they may just not know what they're looking at fully. So have you ever prompted them with questions or given them ideas of what it should mean? Or say that if this situation happens, this will be the result, and then see what they do there. So that might be one issue that you face. If you are hopefully getting questions, are you listening to what they're asking? Maybe they might just be maybe they don't really know what to ask, or they are asking really good questions. Listening and trying to get at the core of their question, maybe making sure that they have enough time in advance, even with the financial information. So sending out the reports so they have time to digest it. I know that there are certainly people who prefer more time than just that immediate processing of financials. They need some time to think about what it might mean, or add things up, or even follow up with you offline and say, I don't understand what this is. Can you help me explain? That might give you a sense even as to what you should focus on or areas to share more about. You could also even just provide space for people to write notes or to write questions down on a piece of paper, or voting through that format instead of always just open-ended verbal discussions, because that just really doesn't work for everybody. And your goal, it really is to listen, to get that feedback. Just like Kim was sharing how she went around during that season of like, how do we use our space, and just listening, attending those meetings and hearing what people are saying and reiterating it back to them really can help make the financial reporting, financial decision-making feel more robust and more meaningful, and probably more valuable to those who maybe have traditionally been not as interested, or they just don't understand it and they feel disengaged. So if any of this, is something that you want to, learn more about, please just put your questions in the chat and we will speak more at the panel time. But also, if this is something that you feel you want training on, or you need some more expertise, chat amongst the group and reach out to Melody or I. We are very excited to always help in this space and want to be able to help make sure that our clients, those that we work with, but those even that on this call today especially, are understanding themselves first enough to be able to then share, or if you're in the receiving end, that you're understanding what's being shared with you. So all of that is about telling the financial story, and numbers are a language. We might be, sometimes I feel a little bit nerdy seeing that, imagining that I think I speak numbers, and Melody can relate to this, but the reality is it is a language and it does tell us things. And so that's what Melody is going to now talk a little bit more about in some of her experiences.
Thank you, Hannah. It is storytelling, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the story aspect of it. When I was teaching brand new accountants, some of them would say, I don't want to do this because it's math. Or a business student who had to take accounting would say, why do we have to learn this? It's math and it doesn't relate to me. And one of my really passion points when I was teaching in college settings was to help explain that accounting is a language more than just math. And yes, there's numbers to it, but it's trying to tell a story, and it's supposed to be that business story. And if we're not presenting it in a way that's meaningful, then we've lost and disconnected from that storytelling. There's a number of things that point to when we can tell a story as well. And many of you do this with your ministries. You talk about actual applications, or how, the impact has changed lives. Those stories stick. And that's why we want to put it into that format and be able to tell the story and impact of the financials the same way we would tell a ministry story. So when we do that, the first thing is to step back and determine who is the audience. So to Hannah's point, sometimes it's your leaders, your board, other executives. Sometimes it may be the donors or other recipients of the organization's mission who need to understand. And you're not going to present the same information potentially the exact same way, because those audiences vary greatly. And we need to consider what they see and what their viewpoint is. Also, what do they need? So to Hannah's point again about asking questions, we too often, do the accounting language thing and then say, okay, any questions? Well, they're deer in headlight at that point. What about instead starting with, okay, if there was something you needed from finances, what would really make a difference in your decision making? Or what do you really want to know? So oftentimes we don't necessarily go to the other side because we're more comfortable in the analytical and presentation format of accounting than risking what they might say and feeling that we're out of our comfort zone, and can we interpret and present in a way that is more meaningful. And ultimately, what is the message that we want to convey? What's the need, and what's the message then that can go to helping that need and answering the question? The quote Hannah read earlier comes from a book by one of the Heath brothers. I'm a huge fan of the Heath brothers. They have making changes, but it's about sticking. That's partly where the sticky story idea comes from. But the quote came from their latest book about making numbers count. And in that, they also reference the fact that because numbers are not a natural language, and if we go above the number 5, people tend to then just start grouping together and not necessarily seeing the minute details that could be in that information. So what we need to do instead is put it into a context that is more meaningful. And some of the phrases they give are, well, this means that, or think of it this way, or by comparison. And I loved a few of their examples in the book. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this very point, putting it into context. How would you describe the size of a nucleus? Okay, if you're a scientist, you probably have a very scientific answer. But for the rest of us, is that going to resonate? Probably not. So I loved their thinking here. They said, imagine a bee in a cathedral. That's the size of the nucleus. Or imagine a pea, an individual pea on a racetrack. That's the comparison to a nucleus. That has so much more meaning. There's visual, there's context. We can understand that. I'm going to give you one more. What's the difference between a billion and a million? Okay. They make the point that the larger the numbers get, the less context we often feel, and it's harder to then put it into decision-making context and actually use the information. So 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. 12 days versus 32 years. That helps, right? That gives you context. Or we can take it and say, what if you win the lottery and you're required to spend $50,000 per day? How long would it take you to spend 1 million or 1 billion? If you win 1 million, it would take you 20 days. Wow, 20 days, and I've spent it. If I win 1 billion, it's going to take me 55 years. So again, 20 days versus 55 years, I think that helps the context. I remember too, as a parent, some of you may relate to that, of, what does time mean to a child? We often talked about the number of sleeps before we would go on vacation, the number of times, in other words, they'd go to bed, or how long a favorite TV show was, the number of shows that it would take to be an hour kind of equivalent. So that's what we're getting at, is trying to, instead of go to the first one, this traditional accounting of analyze, and then we think it through and we champion the change, but we do it all very analytically, is to try to communicate on a more meaningful measure to those who are not accountants by trade, and help them to see why it matters, or see the relevance and the why, feel the impact. You felt the difference between 1 million and 1 billion when there's context versus just saying it. And that then, when you put that context and feeling to it, helps to fuel an actual change. So it's important that we understand we don't want to leave people out of the conversation. So we need to consider ways to reimagine and focus on ways to communicate differently. So this fascinated me, my CPA brain and my teacher brain. I wanted some more examples. So some of you may be aware of the Bible Project. And I went to a friend at the Bible Project and said, hey, can I pick your brain and can I talk to you about how you do things? And they shared some examples with me. So Hannah, if you want to go to the next slide. One of the key things, obviously the Bible Project has a little bit of an advantage because they're already storytellers. So some of this comes naturally to them. And so what a better way to learn than to talk to them. And one of the things that became clear to me right away was their language changed. They didn't communicate internally or externally with traditional accounting language. So here's their proposed budget. And notice the classifications and the way they structure it. Now, there are some things that are common, finance, but a lot of it is termed differently so that it's more friendly to the whole audience than just a limited few who may think from one perspective. I also talked to him then about, well, how do you incorporate everyone? Because their CFO has a viewpoint similar to mine, that the finance is not just a function of the accountant and the CFO or treasurer. It really is part of the whole organization. Because if we're talking the language of business, and if we're making decisions that impact the mission, that piece is really belonging to all of us. And we have to understand it so that we can maximize our impact and we can understand what we're doing. So this way it helped by presenting their products and support functions. First of all, that helped the internal audience know what was the difference between program and admin in general, just saying it differently. The Bible Project also uses zero-based budgeting every single year. And while I understand the limitations, and I know some accountants are going to roll their eyes and like, oh no, that's too much. They have the tools, and this is part of it, because it is not a burdensome process, because they have the right tools and they've set the right culture and they've, set this up well. But by having each team start with a zero base, come to an all hands on deck meeting and present why they want this piece of the pie, the budget pie, and what they intend to do to achieve mission, it helps then, again, that culture and communication throughout the organization. And what they have found is someone will say, oh, wow, we didn't realize you were doing that. Let's partner with this because this is what we're doing. Or back to Kim's point of just putting them in physical proximity, you start to end up with new collaborations and new synergies. And that's what the zero-based budgeting has done for them. It's really opened up the conversation and brought in the whole organization, not just the finance team. Hannah, if you want to go to the next example, got a few more slides that came right from them. This one is part of an external communication. And I realize part of it is small, so you can't see it all. But the idea, again, was to put a visual, because we do better with visuals than number charts, and explain things in a context and a language that was meaningful to everyone. So here they describe the products to their external audience and what those products are. Because if you say Bible Project, you may know the videos, but you may not know the other pieces, or you may know that they have reading plans, but not know about the videos or other things. So this is a way of taking an annual report or a communication with donors or users and transforming the language into something that's easy to understand. Go ahead to the next one, please. Same thing here. Now we combine the visual, and yes, it has a graph. And there's nothing wrong with some of those traditional accounting measures, as long as we can help to put context around it and help to explain it. And their information on impact, what they're communicating is who's new members and who's now taking part in some of the offerings that we are offering as our products, and what's the difference that it's making, because we want to know that we're on point and that we're achieving what we set out to do. I love too this other piece I put in there about generosity, that no one has to pay for their materials because they've already been paid for by the generous patrons. It helps, again, it's something that's intuitive to most of us, and most people that would read this would even know that if they stop to think about it. But this call to remember that piece of it that we might not automatically have at the forefront of our brain. Next one, please. This, while it's text heavy, I loved, because in their annual report, in one of their communications with donors and anyone who's interested, because you can get this information even if you're not a donor, they explained that administrative slice of the pie. So often as accountants, we look as program as, well, that's the be all, that's where mission is happening, but we can't do mission without the other pieces. So this to me was much more intuitive and easy to understand than just saying, well, that's the administrative support that we need. It actually went into some of the specifics of how that makes a difference. And you'll notice towards the end, through the generosity of people like you, we have grown a lot in the last years, now topping 60 employees. So it's making those connections between what your audience is doing and what you're doing internally. And I love the piece, the last sentence where they share about the culture as well. You know, they describe it as slightly scrappy. And I know that some of my peers in public accounting kind of cringe when I talk more culture and soft skills, but that culture is an integral part of the financial story, and they should be more integrated. And so some of what I care about with the translation is that we connect more of those dots and we make it more of a language that we can all talk and identify with. Next one, please. All right, so what are some ways that we can re-communicate the bottom line? So we do a lot, you know, to present a statement of activities or budget to actual and explain the numbers. But instead of always trying to explain our format, maybe there's ways we can put it into something that is more self-explanatory, or the context that we were just talking about. If we can do that, then as Hannah was talking about, we go from just reporting on the past to helping everyone who's reading it predict the future. Because the real benefit of the financial information is helping us to see where we're headed, how we have to adapt, and what we can do with the future. So those are important pieces, and we've got to then have that full perspective to the different voices in order to be able to adequately apply it and have the varying applications. It's more than the CFO and the finance team who are making those decisions. I talk to people oftentimes who are not part of the finance team, and they say they don't even as employees have the context. Well, I was given this budget, but I don't understand why I got this budget, or what is included in this budget versus somebody else's budget. So that's back to where the Bible Project, why they do the zero base, so that there's a greater context and understanding. I've also heard, especially with some of the mega churches, staff members or members of the church say, well, you know, we could be doing so much more if we didn't have this huge building, especially now that members are not always coming back to services. It's gone more virtual. There's a reason, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. Maybe one of the metrics you look at is, how is your building part of the mission, and why does the building matter? So that's the idea of where we're trying to translate that bottom line. All right, if you want to go to the next one, Hannah. Now, this is just to remind you of a visual and a dashboard, and this one still is somewhat accounting heavy and text, but I was going to use it as an impetus to talk about, okay, the why. What are some of the measures we could put on here? The presentation format is important, but more importantly is, what is it that you're measuring and giving the information around? So some of the traditional ones that we measure obviously are giving, you know, the total dollars of giving. But what if you did, and some of you I'm sure are doing this, a simple distribution of giving? So how much of your giving is below $100? How much is 100 to 500? And you keep doing the increments to whatever measures are most meaningful to your organization. That helps you see the volume versus the dollar amount, and who your users of the information might be, and who we need to adjust our story to. So that can have meaning just by parsing out the giving versus just having a growth amount or so forth. Another important measure is participation in the mission, whether that's at a church or another type of organization. That how are the people that we're trying to reach involved? What's the volunteer percentage? Are they involved in the organization and understand? How can we correlate that into greater mission impact? So again, different ways to connect those dots, but you have to have the conversation with the different voices to potentially actually develop and identify what are those things that are going to help with impact. One of the ones that I sit on a finance committee for a local church, and one of the questions that came up recently was, how do we know if our church is even a good fit for this neighborhood before we expand an outreach into that neighborhood? And understanding exactly that, the culture of the neighborhood, so that we can be part of and not coming in as a foreign entity imposing, but rather joining. So those are important things. Now, I mentioned the building. I saw a creative one that took the building and it took a typical month, year. You could do it a week, you could do it however you want, or a day. But they took it and they graphed out how the building is used. And then they did also a visual on who's using the building. And what was very informative and clarity again in those messages was the building is a mission, because we're reaching, and this is the community we're reaching, and this is how the building is part of the mission. So those are all just ideas. And hopefully you've gotten some, and maybe we can share some more in our panel discussion. And anything else you wanted to share, Hannah, at this point?
I just think that a lot of the season that we're in right now is a great opportunity for this sort of conversation, because while we can feel confident that we understand what's happening as leaders, or being, the reason we exist and where we're headed, as organizations, as congregations are kind of evolving, and there's definitely people moving in and out of them right now, there are many new people, many new faces that are probably not as familiar. And so these sorts of storytelling are great during times of change, just communicating, reiterating purpose, existence, and value, and where you're headed. So I like these visuals a lot. The graphs are always much more helpful, I think. But my favorite actually was the paragraph that explains the value of administration, because it's often the most nebulous of the categories. People can get behind and generally understand, well, we have this core mission. Like, yeah, of course we get that. But what's this administration bucket, and what are you all doing? And why is it so important? And so that to me was, I think, the best example that I've seen of a narrative explaining value for administration and what their role is in making sure things continue in a healthy way. So I loved that. But that's what I thought I want to share. So. All right. Well, I appreciate your thoughts on this, Melody, as well, and your leadership in this area. I think that you have definitely done a great job for those that you work with, and just for our industry to reiterate the value of communicating in a way that people understand, taking that jargon and translating it and making sure it's meaningful and useful. So we are going to take the next 10 minutes to do another breakout with everybody, and then we will have another little bio break as well. So Kristen, feel free to send us to our groups, and then this is a great opportunity in your group right now. If there's any final questions for the panel, we have definitely gathered some up until this point, so we're soliciting any other final questions that we can answer for the group before we close for the day. All right. I'm going to start us off with a question that was posed earlier, just in regard to staffing right now. And I think this is certainly a relevant topic for any organization, no matter if you're on the recruiting side or just yourself looking for more people to join your team, or if you're experiencing some of the Great Resignation. So I am curious, I might pose this to Kim first, just as the chief of staff, what are you seeing? What are some things that you guys have been experiencing, and how are you responding to that?
Yes, certainly during the pandemic, we had a really high turnover. And then as we're coming back, it's that narrative. People are kind of watching. Are you going to make me come back? You know, all those kinds of things. So we're being really sensitive. The thing that in the midst of the turnovers, the one piece that I would do is that you need more data. So exit interviews are really helpful to find out if there's patterns. So one of the things is for us, there was some that was just straight up life situation. In the pandemic, a lot of people had moved to Madison. It was a requirement that you lived here and worked in the building. As that changed, folks fled. Like, I'm out. I'm going back to fill in the blank. So that was there's nothing we could do about that.
Right.
Which on this side of the pandemic, now we are actually hiring across the country. So it has changed our frame of, oh, you can work in the headquarters in Virginia, so that's helped us change our frame. But there are other patterns that we found in exit interviews that it is within our scope of influence. So the younger the person, I would say I started tracking, I don't see any opportunity for my career development. It's unclear, like, where am I being developed? And again, as a person who's been in this organization for 30 years, it can be tempting to feel like, you've been here for 2 seconds. What are you talking about? Right? To go, oh, but that's a real thing. So
Yes.
you're going to even understand the generational changes in that way. So that was one. Trying to understand, who's our culture created around? Who's like the majority culture, and how might that be if you are not in that culture? And that can be in any kind of, as you think about all sorts of different kinds of diversities. I named age, but that could be ethnicity, right? It could, for us, we're an interdenominational. So sometimes there might be a church group that feels like they get more precedence, that there's a number of them that are in the building. And therefore, if you're from a different church, there's all sorts of different ways that paying attention to culture. And then the other one, I'm sure those of us that are overseeing anything around HR, anybody that has, oh, my supervisor, right? And you just start paying attention, what would have helped you stay? And so then you can begin to shape, oh, are there things that we need to attend to that we had blind spots? So those would be a couple of things that I would say about the turnover, not to panic, but to get more data that then you can say, what do we need to do to change? And then welcome to the transitions, because you're going to have to help your people make those changes, whether that's your supervisors, those that are older, whoever is the majority culture. How do we be more welcoming and hospitable? All of that would then flip into the change management. So
I think that's awesome. I mean, so much of it is just gathering that data and not assuming that we understand, and being willing to face maybe something we don't want to see, we don't really want to hear, and having to really come to terms with that. Or in other situations, it might not be anything you can control. And then just realizing we don't need to sweat over this. It's not something we can change, really. So there's the whole spectrum of, yeah, that was on us, or, that's not really anything in our jurisdiction. And I think that we've also done a lot of state interviews in the last year or so, and just trying to understand what is keeping people here so that we can get ahead of that before it becomes an exit interview. And ideally listening and hearing what matters to people, what's important to them, what is uniquely different about this job, or at Wagner particularly compared to somewhere else. And that also helps bring clarity too, because I think that until we get the actual data, we can't know how to act on this. So
the other thing I heard, though, with Kim say is the data is great, but then you've got to translate that data internally to all the people that need to know it, because too often we collect data sometimes as leadership and we fail to pass it along, and it doesn't then really make the difference that we intended it to make.
Right.
That's super helpful, Melody. Or you may feel like, oh, well, I sent it out. I gave them the charts. I gave them the report. Everybody knows. but you didn't create a pathway for change nor set up the expectations. Like, hey, in the next 6 months, I would love us to, what's the clear measurable that you want to see? And how are you going to equip folks to be able to do that and model that change? So that's where you're like, oh, okay. Yeah.
It's not just data. It's to translate into action. And another area that related to staffing is just in terms of raises and inflation and the general, I think, expectation for a living wage has changed. And it's a reality that many organizations are facing and are needing to kind of figure out where those extra funds are coming from, because I don't know any employer that wouldn't want to give their employees a fair wage. But sometimes there are constraints. Do either you, Melody or Kim, have any insights into that and any experiences that you can speak to?
One of the organizations that I work with, they had very valid rationale again for why they were paying what they were, and it was the best living wage, but some of the employees didn't see it as such. And so again, that message, the translation to those who it impacted was missing. The thought process had been there, but it wasn't adequately communicated that those that were impacted saw it a different way.
That's so interesting. And I think it would be so sad to know that there was a reason that people didn't understand the disconnect.
And one of the things I can say, so a nonprofit that ours is based on fundraising, right? So you've got a whole different world there. So there's no way that I can compete like with my technology team, that we have both Workday and Salesforce. So someone can go to a Fortune 500 company as a tech person, and I don't even want to guess the amount more that they could make than what they make here. So I can't,
Yes.
right? Even like a little like, hey, woohoo, you get a whatever, 1.5 cost of living. It's a nickel, right? I mean, this is nothing. So for us, the thing that we try to do is align people's internal mission and purpose and sense of call with this place, that recognizing I can't compete on the level of where you could go, but there is a choice that you're making that we all are entering in to saying, for the sake of that, I'm choosing this pathway and I know what I'm doing, so that there isn't, you just don't get caught. And I'm not trying to invite you into something that's not upfront. So even for, some of our accountants or tech folks, we're inviting them to even do some fundraising, not the same as our folks that are out on the field, which do 100%, but so that there's equity. But even that is horrifying. Like, what? So it's okay. Well, we'll equip you. We're talking about grandma and your aunts and maybe your church. So it's okay, right? But even that feels like, yes, I am an accountant who is called to this bigger mission. It's bigger than me, and I want to be a part of this. So that's a different way to think about it that I've had to live in the last 30 years, because I can make a lot more money somewhere else, but that's not the reason why I said yes.
Right.
But I love what you're saying there, Kim, because it's helping those who are impacted by it understand the why behind it and remind them. They may have gone into it with that vision, but sometimes we lose it over time, or sometimes we get enmeshed in our own limited perspective. And so going back to the why of this is what we're doing and why is so critical.
And I think I've seen in a situation too where best intentions didn't have enough information, and all of a sudden it's actually caused a bit of an issue. So, deciding what you can afford even for a raise that's reasonable within your means requires really nice real-time data, and knowing that sort of, what are the pieces that you need to take into consideration for deciding that. fixed costs, I mean, that's a lovely piece of jargon. The things that you can't avoid paying that you have to pay someday in the next year. Where's that minimum threshold that we have to commit to? And then where is our wiggle room? And what are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of this? And is that more important? And is that what we are choosing to align to? As opposed to, oh, we need to respond to this and no matter what, and even if it's not aligned with where we're at. So it can be a really important thing to know that you have accurate data, timely data in making those decisions and taking responsibility for getting that data, making sure you're understanding it so that it's not after the fact that you find out, whoops, we made the wrong decision because we didn't ask. So yeah, I appreciate your insights. I want to go back a little bit to Kim's session. And you had talked about, you said, if a team hasn't heard from you, I love this quote, they will write their own story. Just providing that clarity over certainty sometimes. And I've heard a quote from Brene Brown, you know, if we don't have enough information, we tell ourselves the story in our head. And that is a very real thing. And how do you navigate the as a leader, the fine line of confidentiality and transparency and what you can share and what you can't share, and what's been some stories and experiences those last couple of years and looking ahead?
Yeah, that's great. I would say probably we tend to err on the side of less is more. Like there's all sorts of reasons and the intentions are good. I don't want to have people think I don't know what I'm doing. And so I got to wait until I have a fully orbed plan. So often that's just one example, right? Or I don't want to burden them. And so the leader, I'm a servant leader. So I just need to hold all the weight of this. And I don't want to distract or burden folks, right? So I bet we could come up with 15 different reasons why we tend to not communicate rather than over communicate. I think it's actually a rarity that someone would say, okay, please stop. I have too much information.
TMI.
Yeah, right? Especially in the pandemic, right? I mean, everyone was like, just like more is more in that setting. So I think some of it for us is even uncovering, what am I afraid of? Is it my own, like I'm going to be seen as incompetent? Is it, I'm not a servant leader. I'm not matching my values. I don't want to put this on anyone. What is it that is behind my choices? So that's some almost self-reflection work to do. But then recognizing, even in the thing about staying. So my fear, like right now, let's talk about finances. We are in, my CFO does not want to call it a financial crisis. We are in a financial challenge right now. And so the fears, right, of not wanting to burden people, but it's not like we are these are all the words that we're using. Let's co-create as teams. How can we cut our budget this year down 10%? And folks appreciated being around the table. It felt a little bit like Apollo 13, right? If anybody knows that movie.
Yes.
How can we use the pieces? They felt like they had agency rather than it was a top-down decision. Like you just, I might never have used this benefit, but the fact that you took it away, I'm all right. It's that whole roller coaster ride of emotions. And so actually bringing people in is more helpful than we think. They get to have agency in their future. They may find solutions that you and your leadership team never would have thought of. And so I think confidentiality is a different kind of thing, right? Maybe around employee, when you have some issues of performance and there might be a termination, there's things that are not appropriate or right or compliance-wise that you can't say. So that's a whole different category. But I would say you have to figure out, how do we talk about it when people are being let go? How do you say what this is, what this isn't? We're not handing out pink slips, whatever is the narrative. Like if that person, if they could let Kim go, right?
Right.
So it's like, okay, wait.
Am I next?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so how do you make sure what's the narrative that could be written? And how do I address that in an appropriate way?
Very
The other
true.
piece I would bring to this, and I appreciate the way Kim is saying it because it reiterates what was going through my head, that the message is important, but it's also who delivers it. And if you haven't created that integrity and reliability that we can believe the words coming out, it's not just a prescribed kind of message, that makes a huge difference. And so one of the things, especially in finance, is you don't want to make mistakes because it's number related, but being okay with making a mistake and being able to be humble and broken and sometimes screwed up in front of people creates a safer space where those messages then are easier to deliver.
Right. And I think that there's pressure as a leader sometimes that if you don't have the answers or if you don't know what's going on, then how can people trust you? Like people are looking for that strength from a leader and from a position of decision-making authority, essentially. And at the same time, I think that even at Wagner during the height of uncertainty, even just saying, we are figuring it out as we go also. And that message was more powerful than I think anybody could have imagined. And just saying, this is my regular update for you. I actually don't have anything to tell you because I still don't know myself, but I just want you to know that I'm here, that I'm available, that I want to talk to you, that, we are listening, we are watching, but that at this point, we don't know ourselves. And that was more powerful than just silence because there was technically no update. And I think that can sometimes feel like, well, how can they trust me? How can they follow me if I don't have a plan or I don't know what's coming? And that I think that this taught us the power on a whole nother level of just transparency and communication and town halls and just the value for that information. And now it feels a little bit different, just kind of transitioning a little to where we're at today and how to even know. I think I'm curious from either of you, just like what are some things that we can be looking for? How can you even assess like what maybe where you're at in that spectrum of ending, middle, neutral zone, and new beginnings? I think the neutral to new beginnings is the most nebulous. Usually when something ends, but that transition space, do you still need that sort of communication levels? What are some areas to like develop so you know where you're at? Is that even important that we know where we're going?
Oh, which phase? Sure. And it is fuzzy. Like I was talking in the breakout with someone that they've been in a 2-year interim place without a pastor. And so clearly that's, they're in the wilderness, but even on the first Sunday that let's just say that they're going to have a new pastor, but that first Sunday is not the new beginning. Because you're still like, what do I think about this person, right? So where exactly is that? Well, it's, when everyone says, yep, it's like, is it a year after the first pastor has been there? Because there's a cycle that you now understand. We now know who we are, right? There's a new, because that person is going to introduce a lot of change into the most likely just by who they are in their own unique style. And so recognizing for those of us that, if you know the Myers-Briggs, right, that are high SJs or just, I want, Kim, just give me the exact fact. What are the 7 things that will tell me? It's more like, can you navigate in the spaces and take cues even from your team? Because the messy middle is the height of all of the emotional angst. And so as people start like, we're all taking a breath, I think we're moving more into this new space. And so then you can begin, right? Like even the milestones. I mean, I don't know what your interpretation was of my crazy little donut party with the president, but folks are like, they're so proud to be the team that they're being honored, right? That's
Yeah.
a different thing than if you make me move my plant to the other side of the building, it's gonna die and that'll be on you. I'm like, we are in the messy middle right
Wow.
now. And I'm like, okay, all right. We
Yeah.
need more feedback, more input. So you can kind of take the cues from
Yeah.
what's happening.
Well,
Yeah, that's
and
a good
exactly
point.
what you said too, Hannah, about even just saying when you don't have an update, that important part of coming alongside and all being a team, not just to him's point, being top down and saying, okay, here's where we're at, and here's how it's decided. One of the key pieces to that is what you've been communicating, Kim, of you've got to be actively listening though, too. Too often we do make those decisions without the context of hearing from the people who are truly impacted and then making it an appropriate either communication if the decision is different, or maybe it bears into the decision.
Yeah. Well, and I just wonder, like, what are some tips for this group? Maybe they're coming from a space where that is not what they're experiencing. How do you begin to have influence? How do you start a feedback process? How can you pitch that idea? What can you do to promote that in your organization if that's not what you're experiencing? Because we're all talking from like places where that seems to be like a normal thing, but that isn't necessarily true for many organizations, or it's a really small group, or everybody's involved, or it's like one person's in charge. So how do we start that at an organization?
Melanie, do you have any initial thoughts?
Initial thought is asking. I mean, again, we can make all these assumptions and think we know, but do we ask?
Yeah.
Asking what? Like what are some things?
What is that perception? What is it that they're seeing? You know, we tend to give information and then ask questions about the information we gave versus coming in without an agenda and maybe a general topic, but without a specific agenda or answer, and really truly listening. Okay, the whole idea of the building use, that's something that seemed obvious to a lot of people but they'd never listened to certain people or asked a generic enough question to get that kind of feedback.
The other thing I would offer, Hannah, what I hear too is, right, some of us are in the position to make those kind of unilateral decisions. We're going to host a town hall meeting. We're going to write a monthly piece. We're going to send out a survey, where others are like, wow, I wish we did that. I have some thoughts. I'd love to give that input. And so what does it mean to be an influence leader? Was the way that I would phrase that, because anybody from any seat can influence your culture. And so that might be, how do you create a safe conversation with the person? It's called leading up, right? I look up and I say, who's up there? And how do I create a safe place to offer some input in a way that is not blowing something up, right? Because we all know what it's like to have folks come and be like, why aren't you doing this, that, and the other? I just went to this session and you are getting a big old F, right? And so
right. That's not the goal for today.
let's do this handout together. All these things we're not doing, right? So how do you create a safe place to even ask, to Melody's point, what are you thinking is happening as, using an example someone asked, as folks it seems like turnover is higher this year than it has been. What are you thinking about that? I'm concerned even as we think about budget and our teams. Are there thoughts that you have about how we might even understand why, right? You're just coming alongside, because it's not that the leader is not aware.
Right.
And could be internal things of the reason why they felt like, I don't know what I don't know. And so even the fact that you come in and ask the very question that they may be asking could feel like, wow, there's someone who's offering their partnership. That's a very different frame than somebody up there doesn't know what they're doing. And so, so again, how do we be influence leaders and influence change, which is a whole other like webinar that we could do, but I'm sure you could Google it and there's lots of good stuff out there.
Yeah. And I think that that is respectful too, and a good way to approach it, but like believing the best about our leaders and assuming goodwill and giving them the benefit of the doubt in the sense that they most likely are thinking about this, and it's a lot, and believing that they care about us and they care about this organization and they care about the future, and then coming in with that posture of humility of just asking questions. And this is something that's on my mind. I'm curious what's on yours and what area, what are your thoughts in this area? So as opposed, yeah, like you said, as opposed to, we don't do this, and are you even aware? Am I the only one? And assuming that they're not. So, and I think that there's some great tools out there. I mean, maybe this, for some organizations it may not be possible to do a conversation, or maybe it's actually just too close to home to have a conversation. And SurveyMonkey is great. Anonymous surveys, Energage is another platform for just providing a way for employees and leaders, everybody, to provide that feedback at an anonymous level, or suggestion boxes, ideas, things like that. So I think that can also help sort of facilitate that conversation.
I'll add one more resource to the mix here. I have no relationship. This is not a paid endorsement or anything like
Pitch
that.
for some product.
But in the last probably year and a half or 2 years, I've been listening to a lot of Alex Doerr's podcast, and some of his things. He leads what he calls reality-based leadership, and talks a lot about how do the influencers, to Kim's point, stop the drama. And sometimes it's just saying to the person, hey, I empathize and I get that you're venting. Now, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. No drama. What was that? Alex Doerr?
Alex Doerr, D-O-R-R. Yep.
So, well, I think kind of wanted to shift gears a little bit to more of what Melody, you were talking about in terms of metrics and budgeting. Can you talk a little bit more about that zero-based budget? Because it seems like it can be a bit of a topic that people either really are on board with or really don't understand. Maybe some have never heard of that concept today. So can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Maybe just other ideas for budgeting. What are some options besides that even?
Great questions. Zero-based basically means that you make no assumptions. You're carrying over things from prior periods. You start with a blank piece of paper and you justify every expense, and you start from ground zero. It's time consuming, but it forces you to rethink through the process and take different perspectives potentially, and maybe engage. And for the Bible Project, what it does is it engages other people in the conversation to get those varying viewpoints and doing some of the listening that we've been talking about. But it doesn't have to be, so often too, especially as accountants, we tend to think linear. And so we think, okay, it's got to be either incremental or zero-based. Well, there's a lot of room in the middle.
Right.
How can you incorporate some of the best pieces and potentially make it still having that feedback and input, but yet being cost effective to do?
Well, and it's so much easier to just roll last year's and not have to justify and think through each of the things, especially if you honestly don't know what's coming. So
and one of the things we're seeing more and more is taking that budgeting and doing more scenario planning and forecasting going forward,
right,
because we've relied too much on the past versus trying to actually look towards the future. And again, sometimes we limit it to those who are the finance people or the key leaders. And we're maybe not even understanding all the right assumptions we should be putting into those scenarios if we're not involving other voices.
Exactly. Kim, we are two CPAs. You're coming from a non-CPA background, and yet you're certainly involved in financial decisions. What information is helpful for you? How do you understand? What kind of questions do you ask? How are you, and what's your involvement even in the budgeting process?
Yes. So I so
not.
appreciated Melody's piece, like, think about your user. So my CFO is always like, okay, she'll like change her tone of voice. Okay, Kim. So it means, and I'm like, oh, thank you. Okay. I honestly am like, good, because I don't want to put forward any illusion that I know what this spreadsheet means. Begin
Yes.
talking, it's like you're speaking in another language. And I'm like, what do you, as a person who oversees the change, is this good or bad? Because there's still parentheses, but are these really bad parentheses? So super helpful just to confer as a non-finance person who deals with finance. I'm very grateful for the interpretation that my team does. But what Melody was saying, we just actually created a scenario planning team that only one of the people has a finance CPA role, that the other 6 are from different parts of the organization, thinking about kind of that have futuristic as some of their strengths, that have been on different teams to create tripwires, like event planning. So it's not that they're outside of the realm, but so it's, how do you create folks that have different perspectives of this big elephant that we will call finance, that would bring unique perspectives? And we're saying, okay, if then statements. So our donations were down 5%, which nobody saw. And so we're all kind of in this financial challenge now and trying to reposition ourselves. But then how do you forecast and then even begin to say if then statements? And I appreciate the perspective around the table. Apart from the 5 people, none of them have finance backgrounds. And we're giving that back to our finance folks. And it's exactly what Melody said. I wouldn't even have known to ask or think about that side of the frame.
Yeah. Because there are, there's definitely consequences to financial decisions, but sometimes you don't do those scenarios. You just don't think about what's possible or what's an option. And I'm sure there are many on this just call today, conference, that you aren't sure where the revenue is coming from this upcoming year, or there's been a very different maybe mix of donors and you're uncertain. And even to Melody's point earlier, just, what is the makeup of your donor base? Has that changed significantly? And what's the impact of that? If a lot of our donors are becoming younger, what is the impact of that as opposed to increasingly older donors? And just what are people's financial capacities at differing levels? So
I actually have a great example of that. I was working with the church not long ago that the treasurer did demographics of who their givers were, and 75% of their givers were over 55. Now, traditionally in finance, we might say, oh, this is panic mode. And, we would start to try to solve the problem versus creating what Kim said, a multi-voiced team, because we don't know the answers. We're not the ones with boots on the ground in some of those things. So I think that's a great example of exactly what we're talking about.
Right. Being quick to listen.
Well, and I don't know if anybody saw it if everybody saw in the chat, but I love what Elizabeth said. We call donations expected good from unexpected sources.
I love it. Yeah, that's great. It's somebody else said in one of our groups, a budget of faith at some level. And it is. I think that as people of faith, if you're running an organization that's based on people's generosity and tithing, especially, it is a step of faith, and you're trusting God, but also trusting that people will trust God with their finances and continue to give. So yes, looks like Elizabeth also mentioned on the budget, they have a line for giving opportunities, which is a deficit number. what is that divine intervention number that we need to have? So I appreciate that. I have seen quite a few budgets that to a practical level or a very CPA oriented number practicality would be like, this is not going to work. And yet God, so awesome.
It's that
Well, I wanted
combination
to,
though. Hannah and I have talked over the years because we've got examples of a couple of organizations we've worked with that did building projects, and one was very successful and one wasn't. And I mean, there's a lot of factors. I don't want to simplify it and make it, seem as one factor. But in one case, both numbers had, faith in them. But one set of numbers also had much more realistic vision than the other set. And the realistic view helped make that one the more successful, or was part of the formula for making that one more successful.
Mhm. Yes. I wanted to see if there was any other last questions from the group that we haven't covered that you really would love to know before you leave today. Speak now, unmute yourself. Then I have one more question for our panel. Right.
I just wanted to
take
say I love the resources that you shared, the books and the podcasts. Those are so helpful to be able to go back and have the repetition, so you don't always get 100% of what they're talking about the first time. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so thank you. And any additional resources that you have, would just, don't hesitate to share those either.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, keep following us. We post often, and we do more of these like webinars and blogs, and that's certainly our goal, is to be there for you all and to help you be successful. So I wanted to ask one more question of, as we started with a message of hope, like Kim said, just looking at the list and thinking forward, it can be easy to get kind of sucked into the, oh man, how do we do this? How do we do, how do we move forward? There is hope. And so I wanted to see, what is your final message of hope for this group today as they look forward to leading in their respective spaces?
Yeah, mine is the gospel story that comes to mind for me in this season is the risk. So the disciples have all gathered around. There's these huge crowds, and Jesus is like, feed them, right? And they're like, well, send them home. This is an impossible situation. And so as we talked about, even faith in numbers, right? The faith that one of the disciples named Andrew that had to go ask this little boy, I'll contextualize it, for his peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And then bring that little sack to Jesus and go, here you go. And that faith to say, this is what I have. And yet I am trusting that the masses will be satisfied. And so the hope of the 12 baskets, that's what I'm holding these days in our organization. Like, I get to have a front row seat to see what even Elizabeth said, like, where will be the divine intervention, or where are the things that I can't even conceive today that will be our story on the other side of this. And it may not be like a nice little bow, right? We all know what it takes, the challenge to get to the other side, that messy middle, but we get to have a front row seat to see how the story unfolds. And so just the hope in that story is there are 12 baskets left over. And so that's my hope for you and your organization, that you experience abundance when your physical eye sees scarcity.
Yeah. Awesome. And I think that the hope that I find is always in these sorts of conversations with community, and knowing that you're not alone, and that what you're going through what we will all collectively be going through, continuing to go through, is something that we can help each other through. And that to me is always an encouragement. And so please stay connected. If there's people that you met today, reach out to them, share contact. You can ask us if you weren't able to get somebody's information, just reach out to us. We really do love to help serve in this way, and it's a blessing to us as well. It is, hopefully is to you too. So we can do it together. Melody, do you have anything to add, include? Otherwise,
The two of you did such a beautiful job. I'm not going to interject anything else.
awesome. Well, that is awesome. I appreciate everybody's time today. Kristen, I'll let you kind of conclude with our session.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been an absolute joy learning from you three today. Thank you, Kim, Hannah, and Melody. This was wonderful, really, really great. I will be putting together the recording for everybody, and I will email that out to you as soon as I have that ready to go, along with any of the handouts that were presented today. So you'll be getting that shortly. As Hannah mentioned, we have a ton of resources. We do lots and lots of webinars. We write articles, and that's all on our website at wagnercpas.com. Follow us out there, take a look at our upcoming events. We'd love to see you at more of our webinars and things going on. Thank you again to everybody. We loved having you here today. We hope you found this session to be useful. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Gail.
Good to see you too, Hannah.